Good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone to our Challenges and Opportunities in the 2020 election panel sessions. Tonight we have an all-star set of panelists who I'll introduce in a moment. The first thing I want to do is I want to thank my good friend and colleague Esther Fuchs of the Urban and Social Policy Program at the School of International and Public Affairs, who led in organizing this panel. So thanks very much, Esther. This panel is sponsored by the American Assembly at Columbia University, along with the Insight Center there. In addition, other sponsors are the Urban and Social Policy Program at Columbia University and the School of International and Public Affairs, New York University's Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service, and also the Academy of Political Science. At the Academy, I want to give special thanks to Lauren Candow and Mariana Palumbo for helping organize the event and working behind the scenes with us right here. My name's Bob Shapiro. I'm president of the Academy of Political Science and also a professor of political science and international and public affairs at Columbia University. Our speakers tonight, who I want to thank profusely for joining us, given their busy schedules, are Sherry GLIED, who is the Dean of the Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service at New York University. From 1989 to 2013, she was a professor of health policy and management at Columbia University at the Mailman School of Public Health. She's also served as Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. She is the author of the books Chronic Condition, co-author of Better But Not Well, Mental Health Policy in the U.S. since 1950, and co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Health Economics. Our next panelist is Michael Nutter, who is the 98th mayor of the city of Philadelphia after serving almost 15 years in the Philadelphia City Council. He is past president of the United States Conference of Mayors. Since leaving public service, Mayor Nutter, I'm pleased to say, has remained active in public policy, government, and civic life, particularly as the David N. Dinkins Professor of Professional Practice in Urban and Public Affairs at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. And last, but certainly not least, is Douglas E. Schoen, who is a Democratic campaign consultant and founding partner of Schoen Cooperman Research. He is the author of multiple books, including, quite fittingly and important, The Power of the Vote, Electing Presidents, Overthrowing Dictators, and Promoting Democracy Around the World, and also, equally relevant, Declaring Independence, the Beginning of the End of the Two-Party System. I want to thank our panelists for joining us. Okay, the panelists are going to speak. They were asked to speak each for about 10 minutes. The idea here is to bring together three smart and engaging people and basically to turn them loose and let them say whatever they think it's important for them to talk about. After they talk, I'll be monitoring questions and answers that you should type in the Q&A box that's provided in Zoom. There will be a Q&A segment following the three speaker presentations. And I'll be including perhaps some of my own questions as well along the way. And now I'd like to turn to our first speaker. Sherry GLIED of New York University. Sherry, please.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, my fellow panelists. I was asked to talk a little bit about COVID-19 and the election. And I thought I'd actually start looking a little bit backwards to an earlier election, not 2016 this time, but actually 2014. 2014 is a really interesting election to look at because it is the election that followed the disastrous rollout of healthcare.gov, the beginning of the Affordable Care Act, and the rollout of healthcare.gov, which did not work for the first month that it was supposed to be operating, is high on every public management list now as an example of a colossal government failure, notwithstanding the fact that it probably was not all that consequential from a health policy point of view. People did get enrolled. The website was fixed by the beginning of November. Nonetheless, it was really seen as kind of emblematic of the problems with the Affordable Care Act and with government in general. And that election, the 2014 election, was a tremendous blowout for the Democratic Party. You can see here that President Obama's handling of the healthcare in 2014, only about 40%, 41% of the public approved of that at the time. Overall, Obama's rating in 2014 was an approval rating of just 40%. In the 2014 election, the Democrats lost 9 Senate seats, and the Republicans gained the largest majority in the House that they had had since the Great Depression. So it was a complete nightmare because the website for healthcare.gov didn't work. By contrast, here we are in 2020 in a highly contested election. Just remember that 40% number, right? At the end or in the middle of the COVID-19 epidemic in the United States. And the COVID-19 epidemic has truly been catastrophic. $25 billion in health spending, and that's not actually such a big deal, but it's a lot of money. 200,000 people have died. Over 22 million people have lost their jobs. Over 100,000 businesses have been lost, at least as of May. GDP is down 5% in the first half of the year. Kids across America have lost almost a full year of schooling, which means that's an impact on that generation that is likely to last throughout their futures. And the value to all of us of not being in an auditorium, seeing one another in person, getting to chat with our friends is actually huge. If we think about the costs of COVID, those are probably the greatest costs. Those costs have not been distributed evenly across the economy. They've been particularly concentrated in the most vulnerable populations and in minority populations. In every group, though, almost every American has now been touched by COVID-19. And despite that, sorry, I can't go backwards, but 35% of the population approves of President Trump's management of the COVID-19 pandemic, and his popularity rating, his approval rating is actually higher than Obama's was going into 2014. So I've been trying to think about how you can actually square that. How can you say that you are really upset with Obama in 2014 because of the website crashing, and yet here we have this colossal disaster, and you say it's all right, we think Trump is okay. And I think there are several different arguments for it. I'm going to leave the political arguments really to my fellow panelists because I don't know. But I think there are 2 arguments that people have used that maybe I want to touch on today. One is that it's not Trump's fault, that what happened in COVID is inevitable. And I think the second one, is kind of more interesting, which is really that you like the way Trump thinks about the world in general. You think that the way that he thinks about the world in general is the right way to think about the world. The way COVID has played out is a logical outgrowth of the way Trump sees the world, but you think COVID is kind of a one-off and doesn't tell us anything about the validity of that worldview going forward. So let me just walk through those 2 arguments a little bit. So COVID was going to be a really tough disease to fight no matter what, because it has high rates of asymptomatic transmission. In this way, sort of like HIV, which was really the last big epidemic that caused devastation in the United States in the same way, most of the people who are transmitting COVID don't even know that they have it. The virus peaks before people have symptoms and declines after people have symptoms. So quite a bit of transmission is happening among asymptomatic people, and that just makes it a lot harder to control. And in fact, if you look at the early days of the COVID epidemic, and I'm comparing 3 countries here, the United States, Canada, and Germany, this is the rate of growth in log scale of new cases per million people in the early part of the epidemic. And what you see is all of these countries faced exactly the same problem. The rates of growth are very similar. This was a really, really challenging disease to manage at the very beginning of it. And you see that Germany, Canada, and the US look pretty much the same. But things changed dramatically after that. And I'm actually comparing deaths per million people because there are lots of debates about cases and testing and all those other things, but people who have died have died. And you can see here that the United States is doing much worse in terms of deaths per million people than either Canada or Germany. If we were doing on a population level the same as Canada, about 100,000 more people would be alive. If we were doing as well as Germany, about 140,000 people would be alive relative to the 200,000 deaths we have today. So there is really no question that we have performed worse than countries that were in a similar place when this started. And you can see that much of that worse performance has happened even since August. The rates of deaths per day per million people are just way, way higher here than they were than they have been in other countries. Now, why? Well, I didn't actually reproduce this entire page. Jackie Speier, Congresswoman, has a list of all of the ways that the Trump administration has mishandled the coronavirus response. And chapter and verse, this actually only goes through the end of March. You can actually go through and expand on it. There are just hundreds, literally hundreds of things that the administration did that explain the divergence between Germany and Canada and the United States. We might think about it a different way and say, what would it take to deal with this epidemic most effectively? And sort of what is the worldview that would help you deal with this epidemic? And I think this is a good way to think about it, because in some ways, this is really the Biden-Trump difference on COVID. So if you thought you wanted to have an effective response to an epidemic, and if you were electing a president who would give you an effective response to an epidemic, what would you be looking for in a president? You would want somebody who would lead globally, because it's really critical that it's a global pandemic, that you actually have international cooperation around this effort. You would want somebody who communicates with the civil service. So when you find out that the test at the CDC isn't working, that news actually travels up into the presidency so somebody can act on it. You would want someone who trusts expertise and listens to scientists. You would want somebody who takes national responsibility and sees a federal role here. You would want somebody who's able to communicate and explain nuance. You'd want somebody who is willing to model behavior that might be personally attractive, but that you actually would like other people to do too. In Donald Trump, you don't have any of those things on purpose, right? Before this actually started, Trump had made it clear that he is not going to be a person who leads global response, right? That's his very first speech to the UN General Assembly. He is not going to be the person who is going to communicate effectively with the civil service. He is going to set up a structure in which he is draining the swamp and not listening to the civil service. He is not going to listen to experts because he knows everything better than anybody else. And that is very clear in his way of governing. He is not going to take national responsibility because he wants to delegate more authority to the states and not have the federal government stand in their way. And that is pre-COVID. So all of this is pre-COVID, because this is Trump's view of the role of the president. He's not a person who's going to explain nuance, because he's not a person who thinks about nuance. And he's not a person who's going to think about what behavior needs to be dealt with. I mean, he's really excited about cleaning your hands, but he's not really excited about wearing a mask, because a mask doesn't look very good on you, and washing your hands keeps you away from unpleasant other people. So Trump's entire worldview is actually set up in a way that is not going to be highly responsive to COVID. So what happens in COVID is exactly what you would expect, given the Trump administration's view of its role as a government. If you think that that is the right role of government, though, what you might really say is, look, this is not about the failure of the government to accomplish its goals. This is about doing exactly what we think is the role of the government. And once in a while, a bad thing like COVID is going to come along, but that doesn't actually tell us how we ought to be thinking about the next president. What is more important is that this is the general view of how we want the federal government to behave. So let me stop there, and I'll get questions later.
Thank you, Sherry, for covering a great deal of turf. I was wondering how you were going to do it all. I just want to remind everyone that you should be typing in your questions in the question and answer facility on Zoom, and we'll be monitoring them and asking the panelists the questions. Our second speaker, and we have everybody on the screen here in gallery mode. Our next speaker is my colleague Michael Nutter.
Thank you, Bob, and certainly Sherry. Thank you for that presentation. Quite comprehensive. You know, when you look at the issues for this particular panel, I mean, they of course all flow together. The only thing I would additionally add, of course, is the fiscal impact of COVID-19 on cities, counties, states, and of course, people. You know, I was mayor of Philadelphia through the last at the time called the Great Recession. Now this recession more than likely is worse, but at that time, that was an economic crisis. Companies did, in many instances, go out of business. People did lose their homes. It was bad. It was very bad and very, very tough for cities and counties and states and school districts and a number of others. In this particular case, though, the government, local and state, actually made people stay home. We closed the businesses. Virtually every business in America closed that was not deemed an essential business. Supermarkets, grocery stores, doctor's office, pharmacies, and a few others. And the entire economy virtually shut down, which has now devastated local governments and individuals. Congress, you know, wild horses couldn't stop them from the $1,200 check, PPP, and of course, since then they've done nothing. The $600 extra has expired. There is no funding for cities and states. And so you add all of that with COVID, race relations, protests in the streets, police abuse and brutality, Black people being killed on video for the nation to see. And I point to Memorial Day weekend as a significant inflection point. You know, it's a lot easier to get people to stay in the house or do certain things, certainly on the East Coast, Midwest, and a variety of places in March and April. But as the weather starts to turn, as we're, you know, 2 months, 2.5 months into this, Americans apparently, you know, less on the patient side than maybe, you know, our forebears were in the Great Depression, World War II, and a number of others, just couldn't take it anymore and had to get out. And then George Floyd was killed. And for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, we watched someone die on television, on our phones, on our laptop. Americans, mostly because they were at home, because they were still under stay-at-home orders, still took to the streets during a pandemic. That's how outraged people were, Black, white, Latino, Asian, and so many, many others. And so the confluence of the weather changing, people being at home, outrage at what had happened, and again, no real response to that incident. And then, of course, tape comes out or more information, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, now Jacob Blake, the most recent, and a number of others whose names we know, combined with the disproportionate sickness and death experienced by Black people, Latinos, and other people of color from COVID-19. On the other hand, many of those individuals, Black and Latino, are frontline workers who are also risking their lives to make sure that the rest of us are safe and secure. They can't work from home. They don't have that luxury. And a president, as Sherry certainly would do much better than myself, on tape saying he takes no responsibility, forced California and New York to be virtually on eBay battling for PPE equipment and other supplies in bidding wars. And the death toll, again, as she showed on her slides, pretty much everybody in the same situation in March, but the failed efforts, the confused efforts, the conflicting efforts, the lack of a national policy to address COVID-19, endless, mindless debates about whether or not people should wear a mask, and somehow it became a political football. And the failed efforts by the Congress to come together and provide the financial support, the infusion of cash that only the federal government can produce. No city, no state, no county on its own could deal with the fiscal devastation of COVID-19. You put all of those factors together in an election, and it is no wonder that Americans are angry, they are confused, they are dazed, And I guess I would close out, Bob. And then we saw the spectacle of, as someone said, the first World Wrestling Federation match on live television between two presidential candidates is an international disgrace that we saw last night with one person at least trying to be an adult in the room and make a case to the American public, and the other, it would be an insult to third graders to say that that was the behavior that was exhibited by the current occupant of the White House. We have some serious challenges over the next 30 plus days to turn the ship of America in the right direction. And I'm hopeful that people saw just what's at stake last night. I failed to mention, of course, the Supreme Court issue. I'm sure we'll get into that in the Q&A. You put all that together, that is a toxic brew for the greatest country on the planet.
Thank you, Mayor Nutter. Okay, everyone, please submit your questions. Any question is fair game related to the election or any recent development. We can make this a wide open discussion. And our last speaker is going to be Doug Schoen. And Doug, after you talk, I'm going to have some follow-up questions for you. They're already coming in.
Sure. Not a problem.
I know.
And I'm going to do something now, Bob and Sherry and Mayor Nutter, that does not necessarily reflect either my worldview or my professional position. Now I am working, as some may know, for Mayor Bloomberg proudly and happily in Florida to assist his effort there to bring the state to Vice President Biden. So it's something I say at the outset, and then I'd say personally, I am very sympathetic to the very strong and compelling presentations my colleagues just offered. But there's a but, and I think the but is important and needs to be said, because we're in a presidential election that I think most observers would say is probably just outside the margin of error. It's about 7 or 8 points nationally. The swing states 3.5 to 4 points. So it's not like the majority of the American people unabashedly endorse what I think is a fair view, but not their view necessarily, that it's a toxic brew or that Donald Trump deserves blame for everything that's gone wrong in America. So my point of departure is, what is it that Trump was trying to say? What is it that his voters believe? And how should we see the rest of the election? First, from an analytical point of view, I thought that Trump, both from a polling point of view and from a substantive point of view, is on weakest ground when he's talking about coronavirus. I thought Sherry's presentation and the mayor's compelling remarks make it very clear the way the American people see it. And they do see the issue very much as was articulated. The but is, for a substantial minority, though, they take the attitude that, you know what more could the president have done? How could we have known how bad this was going to be? Dr. Fauci himself was minimizing the nature of the threat until late February, and the president, who has a responsibility, as he's put it, for more than public health to economic wellness, has said, and he said last night, look, I can't just make public health the only issue. I need to focus on the overall economic well-being of the country. We can't close down. And by the way, given what we know about the science, we need to urge people who are at a special risk to isolate, those over 65. And for those who are younger, we need to recognize that there are particular challenges, but we cannot, in actual fact, close the economy down and hope to have a functioning country. The president is still given credit for what he calls an extraordinary economic boom prior to the pandemic, and I think it's fair to say that the electorate still, on balance, gives him more credit than they give to Joe Biden. They see Trump as a perhaps erratic personality, somebody who, in the words of many Trump voters that I've spoken to, is, quote, not a choir boy, but somebody who has stood up to the system. And I thought Sherry had it exactly right when she said he eschews experts, he eschews the establishment and civil servants. And for the Trump voters, their reaction to that would be exactly right, why we're for him, and why, even given his performance last night, which obviously for many was offensive, many of the instant polls that came out after the immediate CBS and CNN polls gave Trump a particularly positive rating, especially but not limited to a Telemundo poll of Hispanics. So I think that to look at this election only through the prism of those of us who happen to be urban Democrats would be a profound mistake. Now, let's be very clear. The president is at a disadvantage. I don't think he helped things last night for himself, but I think there was a clear strategy. I think the president's clear strategy was dominate the debate, get Biden off his game, get Biden to lose his cool, call him, as he did, a liar and a clown, among other things, and tried to make the vice president sufficiently unnerved that Trump's ability to rhetorically dominate would transfer into votes. I don't necessarily think that happened, but I think that's what the president was trying to do. We will have two more confrontations, and my take on it is that last night probably didn't change any minds, but also not convinced that Biden picked much up. And I think for the Republicans and Republican-leaning independents, they got in their own way a validation of what they believe about President Trump, the good, the bad, the ugly, and the somewhat, as what was it, Mayor Nutter said, the WWF style leadership. And I think it's important to say, Mayor Nutter, that President Trump has in fact participated in a WWF match, did win one match against Vince McMahon. And I think if his fallback employment be professional wrestling, like his electoral record, he's 1-0. He's 1-0 in WWF. And in both venues, I think it's fair to say that this president will do anything possible within the rules and outside the rules to get re-election. I also think, and I hope we get questions on this, Bob, that he made it very clear last night that he is going to challenge the results of the election. One thing I think is to put into people's minds, if the congressional delegations themselves are majority Republican after the election, there is a very good chance that he will try to frustrate the Electoral College, throw the election, if he can, into the House of Representatives and win a majority there. Is that a long shot? Yes, but who would have predicted Bush and Gore in 2000? So I think we've got a long way to go in this election, certainly in terms of debates, I think in terms of vote counting, and I think for those of you who would like after last night to count President Trump out, you would be making a profound mistake. Let me stop there.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I want to thank all of our panelists for excellent and very concise presentations that covered really the major part of the electoral and policy map here. Okay, Doug, the first questions are for you. One is from Esther Fuchs, who just kind of wanted to see if you have anything more to say about was Trump's campaign performance last night strategic? And then the follow-up question is the broader question. This is from Jim Capolino, who asks, to avoid a repetition of Trump's victory over Hillary Clinton, what does the Biden campaign have to do differently in terms of messaging and use of resources in the key states vis-a-vis winning critical electoral college votes? And Mayor Nutter may have some comment on this as well.
Sure, and I would welcome the mayor and mayor's comments, and I will keep my remarks brief. I should say to the audience, both Esther and Jim are old and dear friends of mine, going back, sad to say, over 40 years. So I will leave it there on that point. Look, I think it was strategic. I think the president's goal, and I think he'll do it in the town hall in Florida on the 15th, is to dominate the conversation, appear competent, confident, and all-knowing, and willing to take on the system and Biden and make Biden appear to be inept, incompetent, and unsure of himself, as I thought he frankly was in the final 45 minutes of the debate. Obviously, like everybody else, I was disappointed and extremely so that not only did he not denounce in, forthright way white supremacy, there was the dog whistle to the Proud Boys, and I mean that's horrific. But the fact that he had to be called out by the media rather than the vice president is equally disturbing. And particularly, I think many of us thought that after the first, segment on the coronavirus, but for the brief interlude on Beau Biden, which I thought was compelling, the vice president was not in command. And I think for Jim Capolino's question, which is a very good one, there has to be an effort by the Biden campaign to do something that he has not done, and something, Jim, you and I have talked about in the past, in past campaigns, which is to talk about the economy, jobs, and our future as a country. Hillary did not talk about the economy. Biden did a little, but his campaign has really, I think, been quite silent on that. And I think for working class voters in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, to take 4 states, there has to be an emphasis on what's going to be different in a Biden administration. And it's not just a debate about climate change, it's a debate about jobs, the economy, and how we get going again in a way that speaks to the concerns of ordinary people, which I don't think he was successful in doing last night, notwithstanding the back and forth on manufacturing. So Mayor Netter, Sherry, please pick up the cudgel for me and offer hopefully enhanced and better answers.
Go ahead, Sherry.
Sherry, you're muted.
You should take this one, Mayor Nutter. I don't think this is
sure. So I think a slightly different perspective on one of the issues that that Doug laid out. I think it's a little trickier, a little bit more of a threading of the needle with regard to the vice president talking about the economy, which is still, unfortunately, an area where Trump does better, I think, in most polling than the vice president. He, unfortunately, has not been able to adequately explain or convey to folks, and he was trying last night. The vice president gets seemingly no credit for his time as vice president with President Obama. People have apparently have forgotten just how bad things were in 2008, 9, and 10. Donald Trump can talk about how slow the recovery was, which may or may not be the case. But once it did recover, it was one of the strongest economies that we've seen in modern history. And so they handed him a roaring stock market, significantly decreasing unemployment. And apparently that has not translated for Vice President Biden. And then what Donald Trump tries to do is suspend time and wants to act like we're not in September of 2020, that we're still in January and February of 2020 when everything was going well. And now does not want to take responsibility. It's as if Joe Biden has suddenly become president during these last 6 to 7 months, and that the only thing that can prevent the Joe Biden world from happening in the Donald Trump mindset is to elect him to stop Joe Biden, who is not president. So the investment by Mike Bloomberg into Florida has helped the Biden campaign significantly redirect resources to places like Pennsylvania, to Michigan, to Wisconsin, and we've actually seen some growth in Pennsylvania. Most polls have the vice president up 8 or 9 points in Pennsylvania, and much of that growth has been recent. I think that in contrast to 2016, and I'm not criticizing that campaign, but certainly the vice president has been to Pennsylvania a number of times. He's been to some of these other battleground states and will continue. You know, there will be continued complaints about the style of campaigning. Should he be having rallies, not rallies? You know, clearly he cares about whether or not people get sick. Donald Trump does not, and will do whatever because he's the whatever person. One last comment. You know, it's really hard to adhere to the Queensberry rules in a back alley street fight. And I am not suggesting in any way, shape, or form that the vice president should get in the gutter with Donald Trump. But I do believe that if you think about debates somewhat like a classic boxing match, there are moments where you do have to slug it out. So I think he can afford, because the standards have changed. Vice President Biden can afford to be more aggressive. He needs to put what we say in Philly, at least, is a lot more bass in his voice in terms of how he engages with Trump. And, you know, I don't know what the Presidential Commission on Debates is going to do, and they're already talking about changing some of their format. But I think he cannot play with him. He can't go down every rabbit hole with him, but he needs to make his point. It's kind of more like a Muhammad Ali. It's a stick and move. Make your point. Keep moving. Make your point, keep moving, and keep that jab in his face all night long.
Let me just say one thing about the economy. I just want to pick up on the points that Doug and Mayor Nutter made about the economy. Part of the problem here, I think, is that Biden sees COVID and the economy as being inextricably linked. That if you actually want to get the economy moving, the thing you have to do is solve the COVID problem. And if you do that, the economy will move. Biden has a set of economic plans, but his mindset is really, this is the big problem we face right now. We can't get to the economy until we fix this problem. And Trump is saying, no, we can just ignore COVID. COVID is irrelevant to the economy. Those are really very different ways of looking at the problem. And I'm not exactly sure how you persuade somebody who buys the Trump view on this that your economic plans make sense if your view is you have to solve COVID first. So I guess that
fits into your nuance framework, I think, Sherry. You know, Americans, apparently we have lost our ability to connect a lot of dots and deal in a world that has complicated issues. And so everything you just laid out is absolutely right. But if you live in a much more simplistic world where, you know, well, what could he do? And then, you're just going to be racist about it and just blame it all on China. You know, and if he hadn't done some of the things that he did, then, you know, 1 million people would have died. So somehow he is trying to figure out how to take credit for only 200,000 people dying when it could have been much worse. You know, in politics, you don't get credit for the bad things that don't happen. You really don't. And so this is all Jedi mind trick stuff that's going on here, and some people are falling for it.
Okay, the next question's for Sherry, but Doug and Mike may have something to say about the local politics, the state, local, national aspect of this. Okay, the question, Sherry, is: did Germany or Canada, for example, have a better uniform national versus local policy to COVID?
So one of the things that makes Germany and Canada really interesting comparisons is that they're both federal systems like the United States, where public health is actually run by states and localities as it is in the United States. So provinces in Canada. So they faced structurally essentially the same challenge that we did here. But the difference, I think, was several-fold. One is the federal government was much more committed in both cases to science and to listening to expertise and to conveying that expertise across the regions. And second, working with the regional governments as a collective to come up with plans and put them forward in a consistent way. So that you don't have the crazy situation we have now where New York has quarantines against other states within the United States that are run by New York. It's a very peculiar situation. So they seem to have avoided all of that by having the federal government take responsibility essentially for the science piece of this, for conveying what the scientific consensus was to the regions and working with them on plans that they would all collectively implement together. That just wasn't the playbook that the Trump administration was going to play.
Mike or Doug?
Yeah, let me pick up on that, Mayor Nutter, briefly, and please, I'll happily turn it over to you.
Go ahead, Doug.
My apologies. We have a culture in this country that is both very good and very bad. We have a culture of independence, individualism, and a sense that you don't tread on me. It has served us very well in a lot of ways for a long time. But I would tell you, in whether it be Canada or Germany, very different places, different kinds of people and cultures, there's a greater uniformity in compliance with state mandates, science, conclusions. And I think I go forward as somebody who respects those values greatly, but when I see people flouting distancing, flouting mask wearing, all in the name of individualism, independence, and freedom and liberty, it disgusts me as an American, and it disgusts me as a human being. I say that not with any political content, but to try to explain what I think is, again, part of what's going on here, and frankly, part of what explains the Trump phenomenon.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. As I mentioned, I mean, we seem to have had in the, mostly on the coast, which is where things, first the West Coast and then the East Coast, people coming in possibly from Asia, other folks coming in from Europe. The early days, I think, were probably some of our best. March into April, significant compliance, people understood. I think, Doug, to your point, the difference here is it became political quickly. The denial of the science, the confusing messages. The White House says one thing, the coronavirus task force says something else, the CDC with another message. And I just have to believe, and so I will be pretty political. I can't even imagine, I mean, look, hurricanes, fires, tornadoes, massive flooding, are usually localized. And people in those areas usually fairly well comply with their local leaders, asking them to do whatever the local leaders ask them to do. This was, of course, worldwide, but let's just say it was national. Under a different president, whether Barack Obama or I would go out and say even George W. Bush, and look at 9/11 and how we responded. The shutdown airlines, no one going anywhere. People understood, people were fearful, and all across the country. I mean, you didn't have people rising up saying, I have a right to get on an airplane or to go wherever it is that I want to go, and you can't stop me. Because the country was literally under attack. And so, a rational, sane president would have called the 50 governors together and hundreds of mayors and said, look, on behalf of the nation, this is what we need to do. This is not political, right? D's and R's and independence and whatever, and we will develop a national strategy to deal with this. And as things get better in certain places, yes, we can start to open up. The problem here is because Trump didn't want, he said it in the Rose Garden, I take no responsibility for this. So then you have 50 governors and thousands of mayors trying to figure out for themselves what to do. This one's shut down, this one's not. This one's got a mask mandate, this one doesn't, right? All of that activity going on. The CDC says one thing, then they change their guidelines. Coronavirus task force says something else. And so it was helter-skelter. And still today, 7 months later, there is no national strategy or plan. And so This is at the doorstep of the current occupant of the White House. But I do not believe the last two presidents, a Democrat and a Republican, would have ever allowed the country to just roll around like bumper cars or a ball in a pinball machine, careening from, case to case, and just leave people hanging out. There's no reason that some people were going to die, unfortunately. 200,000 people did not need to die as a result of the lack of a plan.
I would say in other countries there are people in Germany and Canada who are pretty anti-science, who are fairly libertarian in their views and so on. But what was really astonishing here is that the president decided to ally himself with them, rather than and I think that's where the problem really comes from.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I want to credit that last question to David Farris, in case any of the panelists know Mr. Farris. I want to combine two questions here. One is simple, the other is a little more complex, as you'll see. The first question is from an anonymous attendee, and the second one is from Michael Stoller. Okay, the first question: how realistic is a threat of violence after the election, or violence by certain groups contesting election results? That's the first question. Second one: what do we do if Trump doesn't leave the White House if he loses the election? Anybody?
I'll take the second one. His term is up, no matter what happens, at 12 noon on January 20th, 2021. And if he loses, he is now an uninvited guest in the White House. And I believe that at a minimum, the Secret Service, I have this dream that it's a loop tape of Julian Assange being removed from the, I think, Ecuadorian Embassy. That's the word I want. Thank you. And I envision the Secret Service literally dragging him out of the White House. There's only one president at a time, and the founding fathers, with perfection and imperfection, figured out that if something goes haywire, you can't stay. I do think that there will be people in the streets the day after the election, no matter what happens, even if it's called properly. And that will be our challenge, to get from election night to inauguration and keep this country together.
And let me say a word about that. I agree with the very eloquent words that Mayor Nutter just articulated. And I would say that one of the things we are going to need at all levels is people like Mayor Nutter weighing in to keep this country calm, to avoid violence, to avoid the kind of protests that could careen into violence. Mm-hmm. And I would say that as we go forward, one of the things that I'm going to advocate, certainly in a Biden administration, but I would dare say if there was not a Biden administration, we need people who have the stature and intellect that Mayor Nutter brings, the intellect that Sherry brings on both coronavirus and health policy. We need people like this into our government to avoid what I think the mayor correctly spoke to is the politicization of science, the politicization of public policy in ways that is destructive, not only to our national way of life, but literally to life itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, next question. Now this is about Bob Woodward's book, in which Woodward described how Trump downplayed the pandemic for months, and he actually knew more than he had let on. Do any of you think that this specific story changed anyone's mind about Trump's handling of the situation?
Not one bit. And I think that his debate performance last night's not going to change much. Certainly won't help him and probably won't hurt him. I don't think the tax story is going to hurt him, given that he said he paid an specified millions of dollars of income tax when it's pretty clear he did not. And I think that the pandemic story that he, quote, played it down, not only is wrong, it isn't true. I think what he should have said, which is the truth, which I think would have put him on better stead, is, look, I was going with what I was being told. It became clear we'd underestimated it. As soon as we underestimated it, we locked down, and I made a decision to balance the science with the economy. That's my job, and I think we've mostly gotten it right. And if we've gotten it wrong, we've changed in the course of time to try to better reflect the national interests and the interests of individual regions, individual locales. And I stand behind what we've done. And I stand behind working with Democrats and Republicans alike, even though there have been challenges on every front. I think that would have served him better than this braggadocio style.
Doug, you know, he can never back up. He can never admit that he didn't know something or whatever the case may be. He's on both sides of every issue each and every time.
Yeah.
And you're left with a confused handful of applesauce for anything that he says. He can't do that. It's not within him.
Sadly so for us all.
Yeah.
Okay, that last question was from Columbia student Kaylee Fagan. The next question is from Robert Williams. And it deals, it's sort of a strategic consideration type question. With a third Trump justice soon on the court and supporting evangelical issues, will evangelicals decide to no longer support Trump due to his misconduct and failure to display democratic principles? That's a twist.
I would say I believe they will stick with him in overwhelming numbers, perhaps not as much as they did in 2016, but I wouldn't be surprised if he runs up similar numbers with Christian conservatives.
And then a follow-up from Robert Williams.
I mean, they've made out the best in this administration.
Yeah. And then a follow-up from Mr. Williams. What effect will Republicans who endorse Biden have on other Republicans?
I would say not much, but even if it's 2 to 5% of the Republicans that move as a result of it, and it's unclear to me that many will move, but even if it's a small number, that could be decisive and dispositive in an election like this, even if they stay home.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, next question from Karen Baird. Now, could Mayor Nutter speak some more about the connection of race and the response to COVID? And maybe Sherry might have some comment about this as well. Mayor Nutter.
I will, but I feel like my colleague has not had as much time as Doug and I. So let me come on after you, Sherry.
Okay.
So the disproportionate effect of COVID on minority populations has been known almost from the very beginning. And I think I don't want to put this to the president because I don't really know what was in his mind, but the fact that the epidemic was hitting particularly in cities in New York, in the Northeast, hitting minority populations, probably did contribute to his thinking that maybe what we really want to do is open up at least the rest of the country by Easter. I think it kind of goes back to this idea, it's almost a visceral idea that COVID is about someone else, that you could stay away from it by staying away from other people, that this is it's kind of like them and us. His general way of looking at the world as them and us can also work for COVID, which it doesn't. And what's happened subsequently is that what we've seen is that a virus that takes hold in meatpacking plants full of Hispanic workers and in housing developments that are full of low-income Black people is a virus that is also going to spread into the nursing homes of Florida and into the suburbs of Texas, and that you can't really lock it in that way. But it is so easy to think about it as something that happens only to people who are poorer or different than you are, and that I think definitely affected the way the decision-making happened.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, again, Bob, to the question, I think it is the combination of not only COVID-19, the disproportionate sickness and death in the African-American community, but also COVID-19 has just exacerbated or put the brightest of light ever created on failures of many, many systems across the United States of America. And so, Black and brown people already had significant underlying health issues, lack of access to healthcare in the first place, which is why so many African Americans, Black people, and brown people, were then so significantly affected. Secondly, as I mentioned earlier, many are in service jobs. So if they're in the hotel industry, they're now at home. And if you're in the healthcare industry, you're right in the face of people who have the disease, and possibly you are now taking it home. Also, in many instances, Black and brown people have more densely populated homes, and then their kids came home, or other family members, which, created additional circumstance and conditions. So, now a household of 3 is now 6. A couple of folks have to go to work. They're risking their lives each and every day. Their kids are now at home because the schools are closed, and they know friends and family who are dying, who they now can't see because, of the circumstance and situation. So, and in the meantime, as Sherry mentioned, Trump is saying, well, that's cities. Oh, as he sees in his weirdness, cities, that's Democrats. My people don't live in cities. They're in the suburbs and in rural communities. And this is not even going on for the most part, in those locales until it hit, suburban and rural communities. And then we got into a political debate about masks and shutting down and et cetera, et cetera. Again, the examples that we've seen internationally, if we had done the things that many other countries did in March, April, and May, we would be, not only from a sickness and death standpoint, but from an economy standpoint, in a much, much different situation here in September. You talk to people internationally, they are virtually back to where things were before. They're not wearing masks. They're able to gather and go places and do things. This is a failure of not understanding the science, not believing the science, and letting the knowledgeable people do their work, as opposed to what you think is in your best political interest, which is the stock market. Last night, he said, well, I brought football back. Really? That's what we're talking about? There are 200,000 Americans who are dead, and you brought football back. That's like a WTF kind of thing.
I would say this to Mayor Netter's comment. I personally agree with that, but for 35-40% of the electorate, they would say, well, we need football. Yeah. It's part of our mainstream culture, part of who we are, part of what we are. It's more than just the game. It's the pageantry. It's the celebration. It's Americana. And while, again, it's not my view, but there are enough people who think like that I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that the president was speaking to a vocal and, I dare say, active constituency in this country.
I get that, but here's the thing: if a lot of these folks were around in the 40s with a lot of that mindset, then a whole lot of us would be speaking either German or Japanese. And I'm fine with either of those languages. My larger point is sometimes you actually have to sacrifice certain things. What do we ask you to do? We ask you to wash your hands, wear a mask, and stay 6 feet away from each other. These were not complicated, convoluted things. And now we had a one of these crazy folks, a bar, suggesting that placing these restrictions was the next thing comparable to slavery. What? Seriously? Because we asked you to wash your hands and maybe stay in the house and stay away from other people. And so, it's just it's a different mindset. I'm sorry. I just, look, I'm from Philly. Maybe I just can't understand.
All right, so here's the problem. Sherry?
Yeah. Okay, go.
So here's the follow-up question that's on everybody's mind. It's from Eileen Espino. How do you think the next 5 years will look like for the United States while living with COVID? Question mark. Will masks, social distancing, and remote learning be our new normal?
No.
Perry, why don't you take that one?
Yes.
All right. So, so there were 3 paths out of COVID, or maybe 4, but the 4th one is probably unrealistic. So there are 3 potential paths out of COVID. One is extremely rapid and cheap testing. The second one is a vaccine, and the third one is more effective treatment. And the entire world, at least the entire high-income world, is making progress on all 3 fronts. We're not going to have a vaccine for everybody tomorrow, but we're already getting much cheaper testing. So many universities are now back without big outbreaks on campus. That's because they're testing. The death rate is falling. That's because we are learning more about the disease and people are surviving it. So, will everything change? I think it is not implausible that 6 months from now, we will have a way to deal with all of this. Will people wear masks? It will probably become the expectation that if you don't feel well and you're sneezing, you have to wear a mask, which is the case in much of Southeast Asia. So that could be a change. But Biden may be right on this. Maybe the answer is just solve COVID and the economy will eventually rebound. And that's the way you have to think about it.
Anyone else?
I don't have the expertise to answer that question with the specificity and precision that I think Sherry just did, so I will defer to her. But I would say something Mayor Nutter said, I think bears repeating. Unless we are able to develop a sense of common purpose, as we did after 9/11, in terms of how we go forward, whatever the science shows, whatever the vaccination record rate of success is, whatever treatment options are, and the like, if we cannot pull together and go forward with a sense of a common purpose, we will fail. Yeah. I think that is fairly clear. And failure is both not an option, is cataclysmic for our country and our democracy, and something that, sadly, I never thought in my professional and personal life I would have to countenance in this kind of a forum.
And Doug, I think that the 9/11 example that you pointed out, and Bob, I need one moment of personal privilege on an issue related to race. That was 19 years ago, out of which was created the Department of Homeland Security and the Transportation Security Administration. And for all these people with their personal freedoms, et cetera, COVID-19 obviously shut down the airline industry, but for 19 years, 18 years or so, somebody in a uniform who does not have a weapon tells you to take your shoes off, take your jacket off, take your belt off, or whatever else that you can do in public and not fully embarrass yourself. We do. Because we want to be safe. Osama bin Laden is dead. A couple others who did whatever they did are dead. But we are still following those same protocols 18 years later because we want to be safe. Bob, I do want to make one comment. We talk about race here. And this is not COVID-19 related. This is really more about the protests in the streets and police brutality. I want people to really think about and understand how Black people are feeling in America as it relates to a number of issues of race, but specifically on the public safety side. Black people, for the most part, and I do not speak for the entire race, but I know a few people, are not anti-police, they're anti-brutality. People want to be safe. And there are some great public safety officers, law enforcement people out there who do a fantastic job. But again, even last night, the inability to recognize that systemic racism not only exists and is in systems. I would suggest it is beyond the usual argument about the few bad apples. There are some things that take place out there. And so most recently, we have seen literally just over the weekend, one of those differences. Trump's former campaign manager, and I know clearly he's having some mental health challenges, and he should get the help that he needs. But this is really more about how there is an interaction. His wife called the police. Somewhere in the last few days, he injured her. She thought she heard him talking suicide and has 5 to 10 weapons in his house and may have fired one. We don't know. What happened? Someone called him on the phone and talked to him and asked him to come outside. He did. And when he was non-responsive to a command, even though the officers were fully armed, some with rifles, he was tackled, handcuffed, and taken to a hospital. Jacob Blake, on the other hand, had no known gun, walked around to the other side of his vehicle to get in the car with his 3 children, surrounded by 3 police officers, and was shot in the back 7 times. You want to know why people are out in the streets? Is because folks understand that there is a difference in how people are dealt with on a day-to-day basis. And there is video of both of those instances. That's why people are in the streets, and that's why people are angry.
Okay, and the last question is a follow-up to this issue, particular issue area. How does Biden fare on the so-called law and order argument regarding protests in cities such as Portland, when Trump is taking advantage of the challenges faced by the Black Lives Matter movement to promote peaceful protests? Why is Biden failing in advancing substantive arguments for economic and racial justice? Or is he doing it?
I believe he isn't. I mean, we did not hear last night anything from Biden about systematic policies to address the issues that Mayor Nutter eloquently spoke to, because we're not going to do it just with protest. I think we all understand that, whether that protest be justified, not justified, somewhere in between, or morally essential. What we need are social and economic policies that advance the interests of those that are economically deprived, particularly people of color. Yet you didn't hear that discussed. And indeed, if President Trump is reelected, which I don't think will happen, but if he is, it'll be because he gets more black votes than he got last time, and he is competitive with the Hispanic vote, which the polling now suggests he in fact is. So while we have had extraordinary protests, I dare say no one has spoken in a compelling and compassionate way about change. And I wish that the Platinum Plus program that Trump articulated, which I don't think he means and I don't think is worth a hill of beans, would have come from the Biden campaign rather than the vacillation I heard last night about not about defund the police, about law and order and what's gone on in Seattle and Portland and other cities. And to me, Biden played into Trump's narrative about democratic cities rather than speaking as compellingly as we have had the privilege of hearing from Mayor Nutter all afternoon.
Well, you know, the crazy part is the vice president actually has released a plan.
I know.
I mean, you know, it has a name. It's, you know, lift every voice. I mean, like, whatever you want to call it. He actually.
But you didn't hear it, Mayor Nutter, did you?
Huh?
You didn't hear it last night.
Right. He's actually has a plan that is directed at Black people and the Latino community as well. Now, I understand. I mean, you're in a slugfest. Policy may not matter, but I mean, he was most effective when he ignored the madman to his right. I think that's the way that stage was.
Yes, it was.
Right? And went straight to camera and appealed to people sitting watching television. And the other thing is, and you know, look, I was born and raised Catholic, and I think he's Catholic, and I mean, he almost acted as if you know, like a nun was about to crack his knuckles if he like talked too long or talked over Trump. I mean, you're in a slugfest here. Just keep talking. You know, my wife is screaming at the television. Don't stop yourself. Keep talking, right? So just plow through it, right? And let Chris Wallace do whatever it is he was doing or not doing. And so make your points. When Donald Trump was asked the question about social justice or black people or whatever, my recollection is his first response was about letting black people out of jail. To which Joe Biden should have said, Donald Trump or Mr. President or whatever he's going to call him at that particular moment, you know, most black people are not in jail. That's not their issue. Like every other American, they want jobs. They want economic opportunity. They want vitality, right? So, I mean, it's just, I mean, that's the racism. Black people, oh, let's talk about criminal justice reform. You know, most of us are not in jail. We're not involved with the criminal justice system. We actually have a few other things that we want to do, you know, in life. And so you have to call these things out and then move on to your point. Stick and move, stick and move, stick and move. I'm going to stay on that.
Okay. I have one last question. We're going to go over just a couple of minutes. This is an endgame question, and it's obviously been spurred by the changes in voting that's going to occur as a result of the pandemic. And Doug had touched upon this. Can you discuss further the implied threat that the president will declare himself the winner based on the election day voting and challenge the ballots of mail absentee ballots? And Doug kind of hinted at the endgame part of that.
I think it's a real issue. I think the president telegraphed last night that he is going to do something akin to that. And the one thing we know about Trump is he ain't subtle. And he is like Mayor Nutter, to follow your analogy, a Philadelphia fighter in the gym back in the days of Yancey Durham.
Yeah. Well, you know your boxing.
I tried to.
I think what has to be conveyed, though, and you know, you've seen maybe some people have seen the HBO Axios, you know, thing and the Red Mirage, right? So apparently, for the moment, most Republicans anticipate that they're going to go to the polls. And Democrats who don't want to get sick and die, right, are doing mail-in, right? So on election night, votes counted on a machine. It may appear at that point that Donald Trump is, you know, winning or has won or whatever the case may be. There are, you know, hundreds of thousands, millions of uncounted, legitimate mail-in ballots. Different states do different things. Florida starts counting 3 weeks ahead of time. Pennsylvania starts the morning of at 7 a.m., right? How many can you count in the course of the day? And so, you know, we all remember, of course, the Dewey administration and the Gore administrations, right? Those elections weren't decided, you know, go to sleep and one thing and wake up the next morning, or 3 weeks later and it's something else. And so we have to help people understand. But the thing is, the federal government does not run elections. 50 states and 7 territories, overseen by mostly elected secretaries of state, secretary of the Commonwealth. They get to decide when an election is done, when it is certified, who has actually won. And so we need to make sure that those voices are out there prior to the election and on election night, explaining to people what's going on, where they are in the process. And hopefully most of the TV folks would not try to call an election where you only have 40, 45, maybe 50% of the actual votes cast counted. That's going to be our challenge, helping Americans to understand that election night is not the end of the election process, but it might be another day or so. But he doesn't get to declare that he's won.
Yeah, it's going to come down to how the post office performs and how the state and local election offices deal with this, which are Republican and Democrat, Democratic in different.
Run by local people, your friends, your neighbors, sitting at some polling place for, 8, 9, 10, 13 hours, dealing with, the tedious responsibility. That's who runs elections. Local neighborhood people, not the federal government.
And to close on that, we're not talking about every state of the United States here. We're talking about maybe a dozen states. we're going to be focusing on election day.
Well, Doug knows better certainly than me. This is like, 3 to 6 states are going to decide who the next president of the United States is when all is said and done.
Okay. Well, on that note, the panel has worked overtime here. This has been an extraordinarily informative panel. I want to thank the questioners, all of whom we didn't get to, for their excellent questions. And I want to thank the audience for attending this. And I especially want to thank the panelists once more for making this a very, very memorable event organized by all the co-sponsors. So thank you all, and good night.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Sherry. Thank you, Doug. Great to be with you.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Sherry.
Absolutely.
I echo Bob's sentiments.
Come on, bring that Florida home.
We'll do our best. Bye-bye.